For most of his life in the Beatles, George Harrison was comfortable standing slightly in the shadows. While the spotlight naturally gravitated toward the combustible partnership of John Lennon and Paul McCartney, Harrison quietly sharpened his craft, absorbing Indian philosophy, mastering the guitar, and writing songs that steadily grew deeper and more personal. By the late 1960s, however, his creative voice had become too powerful to ignore. As the Beatles began to fracture under the weight of fame, business disputes, and clashing egos, it became painfully obvious that Harrison had outgrown his role as the third songwriter. Tracks like While My Guitar Gently Weeps and Something weren't side notes anymore, they were statements. And when the band finally collapsed in 1970, Harrison emerged not cautiously, but explosively. The release of All Things Must Pass was nothing short of astonishing, a triple album overflowing with ideas accumulated during years of artistic suppression. It revealed the so-called quiet Beatle as a songwriter of enormous emotional and spiritual range. Critics hailed it as the strongest solo debut by any former Beatle, and commercially it became a phenomenon. Yet success, as Harrison soon learned, did not automatically bring peace. Despite the newfound freedom, he remained tethered, emotionally and practically, to his former bandmates. He collaborated frequently with Ringo Starr, occasionally reconnected musically with Lennon, and found himself dragged into the increasingly toxic legal chaos surrounding Beatles management. Paul McCartney's early warnings about Alan Klein proved devastatingly accurate. What had once seemed like a solution became another spiritual burden, draining Harrison through endless meetings, lawsuits, and financial confusion. Music, as always, became his refuge. His follow-up album, Living in the Material World, 1973, arrived as a more restrained and contemplative work. Where All Things Must Pass had erupted with joy and release, this album reflected inner conflict, Harrison wrestling with the contradiction between earthly life and spiritual longing. It debuted at #1 in both the UK and US, but the pressure surrounding him continued to mount. That same year, Harrison undertook what would become one of the most ambitious humanitarian efforts in rock history, the Concert for Bangladesh. While the event raised millions and pioneered the concept of large-scale charity concerts, its aftermath proved exhausting. Tax complications, legal disputes, and bureaucratic scrutiny followed him for years, turning a spiritual triumph into another source of stress. Simultaneously, his personal life unraveled. His marriage to Pattie Boyd collapsed as she fell in love with Eric Clapton, his close friend and musical collaborator. The heartbreak cut deeply, feeding a growing sense of isolation. By the time Harrison began recording Dark Horse, his physical health mirrored his emotional state. He lost his voice due to laryngitis, yet pressed forward with touring regardless. The result was one of the most difficult periods of his career. Critics were merciless. The album and tour were savaged, with reviewers questioning his vocals, his spirituality, and even his relevance. For an artist who had once radiated inner calm, Harrison suddenly sounded weary, like a man trying desperately to hold himself together. In 1975's Extra Texture, Read All About It, that exhaustion became unmistakable. Recorded largely in Los Angeles, the album carried a fog of melancholy. Songs like You and World of Stone glimmered with beauty, but beneath them lay frustration. Harrison even took direct aim at Rolling Stone magazine, which had turned sharply against him. It was no longer just about bad reviews, it felt as if his entire identity was under attack. Los Angeles, with its endless parties and industry politics, offered no solace. The spiritual grounding he had spent years cultivating seemed to evaporate beneath neon lights and cocaine haze. Like David Bowie escaping LA for Berlin, Harrison realized he needed distance, not just geographically, but spiritually. His return to England marked a turning point. Back at Friar Park, his sprawling Victorian estate filled with gardens, gnomes, and silence, Harrison found something he hadn't felt in years: stillness. There were no deadlines, no lawsuits looming daily, no expectations of saving rock music or humanity. For the first time since the Beatles ended, he was making music simply because it made him happy. That renewed joy burst through on 33 1/3, 1976. The album felt lighter, warmer, even humorous. This song playfully mocked the infamous plagiarism lawsuits surrounding My Sweet Lord, and Crackerbox Palace celebrated absurdity and imagination. The bitterness was gone. In its place was laughter, something Harrison had sorely missed. Critics noticed the change immediately. So did listeners. The album didn't strive for grand statements or spiritual sermons. It simply breathed. It sounded like a man exhaling after a decade of emotional suffocation. That emotional rebirth reached full bloom with his 1979 self-titled album, George Harrison. Where earlier solo records wrestled with pain, anger, or transcendence, this album radiated calm assurance. Harrison was no longer trying to prove anything to former bandmates, critics, or himself. Songs such as Here Comes the Moon shimmered with gentle optimism, echoing the warmth of Here Comes the Sun without nostalgia. Love Comes to Everyone carried spiritual wisdom, not as doctrine, but as lived experience. Looking back on that era, Harrison acknowledged the shift with rare openness. Between 33 1/3 and George Harrison, he said, "Life had finally begun to align. Everything's been happening nice for me," he reflected. "My life is getting better all the time, and I'm happy, and I think that's reflected in the music." The album may not have possessed the raw, emotional fire of Wah Wah or the epic sweep of Let It Down, but it offered something arguably more valuable: emotional consistency. There was no desperation here, no resentment, no spiritual anxiety, just warmth, craftsmanship, and peace. In retrospect, George Harrison stands as perhaps the most relaxed record any Beatle ever made. Bathed in soft melodies and sunlit harmonies, it leaned closer to smooth West Coast rock than psychedelic revolution. Yet its gentleness was its strength. It wasn't trying to change the world, it was documenting a man who had finally learned how to live in it. Years later, Harrison would enjoy a massive commercial revival with Cloud 9 and the Traveling Willoughbys, but the true emotional comeback happened earlier. It happened quietly in the gardens of Friar Park, where ambition gave way to acceptance. After years of spiritual searching, heartbreak, and self-doubt, George had finally found what he'd been chasing all along: a reason to smile.